Welcome to Resistance Live. Since 2017, Resistance Live has been the go-to home for political and legal news and analysis through a decidedly progressive activist lens. I'm your host, Elizabeth Cronise McLaughlin. I'm a former Wall Street and human rights lawyer, a lifelong organizer, and a leadership and impact consultant for all those seeking to lead big progressive change in these incredibly challenging times. To get bonus broadcasts, ask questions, and more, don't forget to become a paid subscriber to the show at patreon.com/resistancelive. And to learn more about what we do to help progressive leaders everywhere, check out GaiaLeadershipProject.com. And now, here's today's show. And once again, my mic is muted. You guys are hilarious. Okay, so one thing I just wanted to mention here to all of you today is that I hope you all had a wonderful time at No Kings. I know many of you were present. I saw a lot of general posts and the like, and obviously it was a really important weekend in some ways. All that said, I do want people to just remember, because there's been a lot of discussion about this over the weekend, including by folks like Rachel Maddow, that the numbers in the streets, while really impressive, right? Like the last number that I saw was somewhere between 7 and 8 million people turned out. One of the things that we have to remember here is that it's ongoing, sustained action that actually moves the societal needle. And so Rachel Maddow was talking about that infamous 3.5% number over the weekend on Blue Sky. I just want to remind everyone that that data is not about 3.5% of a given population showing up for a protest. It is about 3.5% of a population being engaged in sustained action to bend the arc of justice, okay? So we have a lot of work that still has to be done. Protests are great, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot more to take away from the weekend than just the straight numbers and the invigoration and the inspiration that came with it, okay? So I'm really glad everybody had a wonderful time. I will also just point out there was literally no reported violence by anyone on the No King side of the fence. They had 100,000 people in New York City, not a single arrest. Tens of thousands in other cities without a single arrest. There was one arrest that I saw of one individual wearing a penis costume at a local protest somewhere in the random rural area, and that was it. There were some arrests of counter protesters, but truly it was an incredible nationwide peaceful event. And now we have to take that energy into the future. So I do want to remind everybody, by the way, that we have this new program coming up called Power Lab, a 7-week program to go from outrage to organizing and building community power. Registration closes for that a week from Friday. Scholarship applications, if you want a partial or a full, close this coming Friday. So there's a link for that already below in the show notes. I will make sure it is also linked up here in the corner when the broadcast is over. But please get in on that if you haven't already. We have a great group of people joining us for that. Okay, so we have to talk about the story of the hour, which is the destruction of the White House. I will just tell you all that I don't know about you, but when I first saw the photographs of what has happened to the East Wing, I was aghast. There's kind of no other way to describe it. Obviously, you've seen the thumbnail on today's broadcast. If you're listening here on YouTube, you know that it is a massive destruction of a historical monument. Now, needless to say, I have to point out that all of this is illegal. We had a lot of questions on the Patreon feed this morning about what was going on here. No plans have been submitted to the appropriate historic boards, right? The White House is a historic building. They're not allowed to make changes to it without approval. No plans have been submitted. They're literally just tearing down the East Wing. And I have to point out as well that not only is the East Wing the home of the First Lady's offices, metaphors abound in this one, but also the part of the East Wing that is being torn down was built by FDR in 1942 to cover the bunker that he would hide out in when bombing was allegedly approaching the United States by the Nazis. And, you know, I am from a perspective of the irony, the metaphor, this particular gesture of tearing down this part of the White House is truly just despicable. All right, so what are they planning on building? They're planning on building a ballroom that can seat 990 people. There's already, by the way, a ballroom in the East Wing that seats about 200. Trump claims it isn't big enough. And one of the things that that I do have to respond to, because there were questions about this on the feed this morning, is, of course, when Trump is out of office, and assuming that we have a reasonable human being in the presidency who is a Democrat or on the left, all of this can be fixed, okay? It's not like someone is going to be prevented from removing this, assuming that they follow the appropriate procedure, okay? I will also just point out, and we're going to have more on this in this broadcast, the largest courtrooms that I ever sat in my life, I've told this story here before, but I was engaged in a case involving every mutual fund on earth, basically, back when I was doing securities fraud litigation on Wall Street. And that case was handled out of a courtroom that was specifically built to handle some uber large forms of litigation. And that courtroom sat maybe, by my best guess, about a third of what this ballroom would seat. So, if we need a monument to hold tribunals in the future, that may be the place. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because I got some questions about that on the feed this morning. I'm just going to remind everybody that Alt National Park account that is currently being cited in the comments is unreliable. You should not be getting information from that account. Okay, just as a word of warning, be wary. Okay. Okay, a couple things I also want to just discuss this morning, because there's been some breaking news about Senate candidate Graham Platner in Maine. And we discussed this last week, and people got very mad at me when I mentioned that Governor Mills was running, and that I thought that it was fine to have multiple people running in the primary. Lots of people were all in for Platner. Well, lo and behold, what has been disclosed this morning is that Graham Platner, the man of the people on the left, has a Nazi tattoo on his chest. I'm not overstating this. It's actually a tattoo that is associated with the SS. And the story that has come out about this now is that when he was in the Balkans, when he was serving in the Balkans, he got really wasted one night and went with other members of his platoon, and they all got the same Nazi tattoo. Now, that, of course, was more than 10 years ago, and it begs the question, if you know you have a Nazi tattoo on your body, even if you didn't intend to get it, which strikes me as kind of weird in the first place, how do you not know that a Nazi tattoo is a Nazi tattoo before you tattoo it this big on your chest, right? Why didn't he have it removed? Why didn't he cover it up before he decided to run for Senate? The lack of judgment here alone is really disqualifying, not to mention that I will never personally vote for anybody who has a Nazi tattoo, and I hope nobody else in this audience will as well. There are other people running in this race, aside from Platner and Mills, and, I got very well checked this morning, by the way, by an academic that I really respect on Blue Sky, who said, part of the thing to remember here is that, of course, she will be 85 years old at the end of her first term if she is elected to the Senate, meaning Mills. We do need other candidates that are younger and progressive. And, part of the problem with votes at the moment, including on the Epstein files in the House, has been that the Dems have had too many old candidates die in office. All of that is legit, right? I completely get it. And there are other people running. All right. But I got to tell you, the answer that Graham Platner has given about this so far is absolutely inadequate to explain why it is that he has a Nazi tattoo on his chest. And frankly, I think at this point, that campaign is over. So time to focus on other candidates in Maine, my friends, for those of you who are voters up there. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I will also just mention that there are some Reddit posts of his, the historic Reddit posts that have come out now that are really questionable in terms of calls for violence. So let this just be a reminder to you, by the way, that, the Dems are desperate right now for some kind of white male populist. Why they won't endorse and learn from folks like Zohran Mamdani and Omar Fatah and other folks that I've pointed out here on the broadcast many, many times who are running very successful campaigns is totally beyond me. Why it is they think they need a white populist everyman, but it's really important to dig beneath the surface instead of being kind of pulled in by, yet another set of fundraising texts that, maybe appeared to be a little more progressive than the last. And I will freely admit that when I got his first fundraising text, I was like, oh, this guy seems like he's something different. Sadly not. All right. Okay, this morning, actually late last night, there was a story that dropped in New York Magazine about what's happening at 26 Federal Plaza in New York City. And if you have not yet seen the article, I would truly encourage you to go seek it out, not just for the journalism, but also for the photographs. Essentially, they have been documenting what has been happening to people who show up for their immigration hearings and are detained. And the photographs are so upsetting. I posted some of them this morning on my Blue Sky account. There are just no words for the damage that's being done to families, grandfathers being carted off, mothers with young children being carted off, fathers who are like with newborn babies in their mother's care being carted off by ICE. And again, one of the things that I think is really distressing about where we are is that while we're seeing raids on the street, which are appalling, many of us are not seeing what's happening actually with these immigration judges who, by the way, are employees of the federal executive branch. I have to remind everybody of this. Immigration judges are employees of the Trump regime. They do not fall under the purview of the judicial branch, okay? Immigration judges are throwing out court cases for immigrants, and so that those people are then stateless or here on no status, and they get arrested immediately outside of the courtroom. It's really upsetting. And, you know, frankly, there is going to be a dire need when this is all over for tribunals of some kind. As I just mentioned, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. All right. We also had another breaking news story late last night. Oh my God. Where Lindsay Halligan, who many of you will remember, is Trump's newly appointed U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, who has been charged with prosecuting all of his perceived enemies. She is the person handling, for instance, the case against Letitia James. This woman, who is wildly underqualified for this role, okay? Like, we've talked about this many times here before on this broadcast, went after Anna Bauer, who I follow. I happen to think is one of the most excellent journalists of this era. She works for Lawfare. She received a series of direct messages over Signal from Lindsay Halligan after she reported on the fact that there appeared to be exculpatory evidence, meaning evidence that would determine Letitia James was not guilty of the crimes of which she was indicted, available in the public record. And Lindsay Halligan reached out to her and was like, "You're wrong. You're a terrible journalist. You know, like there's all sorts of evidence that says otherwise." And Anna Bauer did her due diligence. Like, first of all, took screenshots of all of these incoming Signal texts and then said, "Why don't you share with me what it is you think that I've gotten wrong? Why don't you tell me what the evidence is that you claim to have that would, you know, counteract this particular exculpatory evidence?" And Lindsay Halligan didn't have any, first of all, didn't provide any, just kind of continued to attack Anna Bauer's recording. Well, then when Anna Bauer reached out to the DOJ and was like, "We're going to report on these crazy text messages we got from Lindsay Halligan then wrote back to Anna Bauer and said, "By the way, everything that I've ever said to you ever for all time is off the record," which is not how any of this works. I have to say that back when I was a lawyer in Washington, D.C., and I was working on a lot of really high profile cases, this was like right after I was out of law school. I was working on a bunch of cases that like involved whether genetically engineered seeds were poisoning the environment, for instance. I worked on these Holocaust related cases that were extremely high profile, lots of press. Okay. And then a bunch of other cases that were at the time considered to be some of the largest antitrust cases in US history. We received media training as lawyers in those cases, even though at the time it was a very junior associate, right? We're talking like 2 years out of law school. We all got media training. And the first thing that we were told was that, you know, first of all, everything that we were going to comment on to the press, if we got a phone call, had to be reported up the chain of command. And no, we were not allowed to comment on anything without approval of the most senior lawyers in the law firm, which one would think is the way that it's supposed to work inside the DOJ because they do have a press office. Nonetheless, we were also told that, like, if something was off the record, it's off the record, and you have to say that before you say anything else. Most of the time, you were going to say no comment, but if somebody wanted to talk to you on background about a given case, the first thing that you say is no comment. You don't get to go back and like wave a magic wand that says everything is off the record after you've already said it. So not only is this a sign of the chaos right now in this revenge tour that Trump has these U.S. attorneys conducting, but it's also just a sign of the sheer, flat, absolute incompetence of the people that he has put in charge. And I know that is no surprise. We've talked about kakistocracy here quite a bit since January. Nonetheless, this is a truly shocking story. And Anna has written the whole thing up. You should go read it. It's quite long, also quite amusing. Off the Record is now going to become a meme. I can just guarantee it. But it's something to kind of like keep your eyes on, because I have to remind everybody that one of the reasons why Lindsay Halligan even ascended to this position is because her predecessor saw evidence that indicated that there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute Jim Comey. There wasn't enough evidence to prosecute Letitia James. And for her to then reach out directly to somebody who was merely posting things apparently on Twitter about all of this and say, you're a terrible journalist, and by the way, everything is off the record, which also makes no sense. You're not even a journalist. It's off the record. It's very odd stuff. So again, you can go read that piece if you're looking for your daily dose of schadenfreude. Okay. Somebody asked me to explain the issue of what's happening in the Ninth Circuit with regard to Trump's attempt to roll the National Guard into Portland, Oregon. So yesterday, there was a ruling out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that overturned a lower court decision. Oregon, by the way, is in the Ninth Circuit for purposes of appellate rule. Overturned a decision that had found that Trump could not legally roll the National Guard into Portland, Oregon. And this Ninth Circuit panel, I'm going to remind everybody the way this works. You get 3 appellate judges randomly assigned to a case when a case goes up on appeal to a federal circuit court of appeals. These 3 judges, 2-1, ruled in favor of allowing Trump to do that. Something that has never happened in the nearly 30 years that I have had a law license happened next. Okay, so I just want everybody to remember that, you know, we've spent some time here. If you're really old school and you've been with me since the beginning, like back toward 2017, you've heard me talk before about the term sua sponte. The term sua sponte means something a judge does on their own, right? Not with a motion from a party, not with like a request through chambers, but literally a judge steps in and does something of their own volition without there being any prompting from a party in a case, okay? Last night, a judge on the Ninth Circuit, sua sponte, requested an en banc rehearing of that case. So for those who are not familiar with the way appellate jurisdiction works, let me explain this just in layperson's terms, okay? If you get a ruling out of a federal district court, you can appeal it to the Circuit Court of Appeals. That's what happened here. District court says Trump can't roll the National Guard into Oregon. Then there's an appeal to a Circuit Court of Appeals. Again, you get that randomly assigned 3-judge panel. That is then decided by the Circuit Court of Appeals. If, however, ordinarily a party doesn't like what that 3-judge panel does, you have the right to request something called an en banc rehearing. En banc means the entire circuit, or in some cases, it's like a much larger percentage of the circuit. In the Ninth Circuit, it's 11 judges, rehears the case, okay? But literally never, in the nearly 30 years that I've had a law license, have I ever heard of a judge requesting sua sponte, an en banc rehearing of the case. That happened last night, in this case, less than 2 hours after the 3-judge panel ruled that Trump could in fact roll the National Guard into Portland. So they've asked for briefs by tomorrow on whether or not there should be an en banc rehearing of this case. And again, I have to remind you all that one of the backstops that is holding firm in at least like 75% of the cases right now is actually the judicial branch. This is a remarkable emergency action taken by a single judge in the Ninth Circuit who knows that Trump is not allowed to roll the National Guard into a given city as a form of invasion because he feels like it. And so again, we're going to see whether or not en banc is granted here. Again, that's not an appeal as of right. The circuit court can always reject an en banc appeal. But the fact that a judge on the Ninth Circuit has requested this is truly unusual. Like, I mean, unusual is like toning it down. I've never heard of it being done before. So we will see what happens with this. There will be a decision on whether or not there's going to be an en banc rehearing. I would bet by the end of this week. So something to keep an eye on right now. Obviously, those of you in Portland are doing great work. Shout out to the frogs and the unicorns and all the other many blow-up costume folks who are currently in front of ICE facilities dancing around and throwing parties. I appreciate you guys so much. My hope is that we are going to see, again, a judicial backstop to these obviously illegal efforts. Okay. that brings me to a couple quick things that I wanted to talk about before we get to tribunals, because there were some requests this morning to talk about what judicial tribunals could look like when the Trump era is over. And we do have some models that I want to talk through. But the first thing that I just want to mention here is that I've said this a couple of times here before, several months ago, and I just think it's worth repeating here. It's really critical to remember that very little in this administration is actually a quote unquote distraction. Okay. Those of us who are commentators with major followings have actually been kind of like bothered by the way in which people frame things as a distraction all the time when it comes to Trump. Ripping mothers away from their children is not a distraction, right? Tearing a facade off the White House of the United States of America is not a distraction, all right? Multiple things can be true at once, right? Yes, there can be an ongoing cover-up of the Epstein files. Yes, the government can be shut down while Trump puts in a $250 billion, whatever it is, $250 million addition to the White House, okay? Those things can all be true at once. None of them are a distraction, okay? The only time in the last few months where I have notably said that something has been a distraction was when Trump released MLK's FBI file in an attempt to distract from not releasing the Epstein file. That was obvious. That was like a play for some press, okay? But this stuff, right? This stuff is not a distraction. Destroying the White House, which is like an American monument, not a distraction. And so from my perspective, I just would like to remind everybody that, everybody who's out there saying everything is a distraction from the Epstein files is actually really doing a disservice to others, because we're living under fascism. And we can be living under fascism and simultaneously have a cover-up undergoing at the same time. One is not a distraction from the other. The actions of a fascist government are never a distraction. And we have to be able to hold multiple truths at once if we're going to effectively fight back against what's happening, all right? So the distraction discourse needs to die, in my opinion. It actually really doesn't serve anything. What it does is seek to shut people up who are pointing to really serious corruption, crimes, illegal actions, right? Which the White House destruction is, ignoring that, right? Or downplaying it actually is one of the ways that we normalize what's happening. So let's get rid of that language, in other words. And, trust me, if I think something is a distraction, I'm going to tell you, but I got to tell you, I don't think any of this is a distraction. And part of the problem with it is that it is overwhelming if you put it in a box that is like, none of this is a distraction, which is kind of the point of why they're doing it. But that's a conversation that we talk about a lot over on the Ripple Effect channel, by the way, if you want to talk about it. We have a whole video, by the way, that went up yesterday on the issue of political burnout, and you can check that out. And I will also link to that up here when the broadcast is over. No, posting remigrate on the Department of Homeland Security Twitter page is not a distraction. That is a threat from a fascist government. Again, this is one reason why people have to get really clear, okay? If you claim that something like the Department of Homeland Security using the word remigrate, which is an overtly fascist, anti-immigrant term, is a distraction, you are downplaying the actions of a fascist government to engage in ethnic cleansing, which is a form of genocide. All right. We don't downplay that. We don't downplay that. Really, really clear here, people. We've got to understand that we have to be able to hold the container of all of it at once. All right. I want to talk for a second about tribunals. So I was asked today on the Patreon feed, reminder, by the way, we are running a promo. It's linked below now for the remainder of the year, where you can join us with an annual subscription at 20% off using the code FALL2025. Over there, you can ask me questions for 3 hours before every broadcast. If I can't answer them live on the air, I will generally answer them in writing. And also you get access to weekly bonus broadcasts and all sorts of other good perks. So head on over there if you've not yet already and support the work that we do here. As for tribunals, there are some examples from history of tribunals that have been established, even inside the United States, to adjudicate unusual sets of events. All right. So when we think about tribunals, what many people think about is the Nuremberg trials. Okay. Another version of this is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa after apartheid was defeated. Okay. But here in the United States, we actually have a really recent example of this that I happen to have litigated in front of. And that was the Victims' Compensation Fund for victims of 9/11. All right. And I was a part of a pro bono organization called Try Lawyers Care, where we each took pro bono representation of people who had either lost loved ones on 9/11 in the attacks or had themselves been victimized as first responders. Okay. What happened in that situation was that Congress set up a tribunal to compensate people who had experienced losses as a result of 9/11. And they gave a mountain of money to this, right? And the way that it worked was that you had to appear in front of the special master, who was a man named Kenneth Feinberg. He's an incredibly famous mediator. And you presented evidence like you were at a trial. Here is my client. They were on the 101st floor of the North Tower when the first plane hit. They checked in on that particular day. We know that they were employed at Marsh & McLennan, which lost hundreds of employees in the tower on that day. Here's their employment history. Here's their actuarial stats of how long they were expected to live. And you presented all of that to the special master. And then the special master was empowered by Congress to rule. And by the way, the federal rules of evidence applied to a lot of this stuff. Was then empowered to rule on the amount of money from the fund that could be provided to victims. All right. The minimum that was given to any family that actually lost someone in 9/11 was $400,000. So we're not talking about small amounts of money here. Like, I want this to be really clear. And this entire tribunal was set up by an act of Congress. Okay. So why is this important in the current moment? Well, it gives you a little bit of a roadmap for how something like a Nuremberg style trial could be set up in the United States. With the will of Congress, we could, for instance, have separate tribunals for criminal trials for the conduct of ICE. All right. And we could have judges empowered to rule on those cases. We could have determinations set by legislation of the federal rules of evidence potentially applying to those. And we could have determinations by Congress, again, contained in a separate legislation of how long people would be potentially subject to sentencing. All of this is possible with federal legislation, all right? And again, I have to remind everybody that this is one reason why electing people who are invested in holding this administration accountable is incredibly key, right? I said this like last week, but the basement for me of candidates running for office right now, and there's lots of other things I want to see, but the basement is, are they willing to take the GOP and ICE and this president and all of his enablers to task for the crimes that they are committing right now against the American people and against people who live here? So one of the things that means, by the way, is that you've got to get very invested in races for office, right? Because we have to take back the House, we have to take back the Senate, and eventually we've got to take back the presidency, or none of this will be possible. All right. But could it happen? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, one of the things that I think we've also just got to talk about here is that there's plenty of people running around right now, like with these ideas that ICE should take their masks off. That does nothing. Can I point this out? That does nothing unless you are willing to actually hold ICE accountable. Right? So like abolish ICE is the floor. Do we all understand that? That's like the basement of what we want. What we actually need is accountability and legal tribunals that will hold the people who are committing what are fundamentally crimes against humanity accountable for their actions. And so people who are talking about, oh, we need to reform ICE or we need reasonable immigration policy are actually not doing what is necessary right now for forward-facing accountability for these crimes. We need people who actually really get it. And so, one of the baseline questions that should be asked of anybody who's running for federal office right now is whether or not they support the abolishment of ICE, whether or not they support massive reorganization of the Department of Homeland Security, which, by the way, was only established after 9/11 itself. All of this is really critical for future elections, all right? And I have to remind everybody that even if Trump remains in office until 2028, which given his health is a big question mark, taking back the House would allow us to start investigations. And the evidence from those investigations could then be used in future tribunals. So the 2026 election is no small thing. And, I also just have to remind you all that Trump's poll numbers, the GOP poll numbers keep dropping. I don't think that they're actually effectively anticipating what's to come next year, notwithstanding all of their efforts to engage in voter suppression. And, we're pretty much a year away now from the midterms. So if you're not already engaged in local campaigns, now is the time to start thinking about that, of course. But also, I do want to remind everybody that every single member of the House of Representatives, is up for election every 2 years. So this is a moment to, start thinking about not just your own rep, but reps in your region who may potentially need your support. And please don't forget, by the way, we have some very, very important elections coming up, like in a matter of days now. We have the governor's election in New Jersey. We have the governor's election in Virginia. We've got various other state and local elections around the country that really make a huge difference. So very, very important right now to get invested and involved if you haven't already, to vote if you live in a place where there is an election coming up this coming November. Critical. Early voting opens here, I think, sometime around the 27th. I can't even remember. Mail-in voting is already open in New Jersey. I believe it's already open in Virginia as well. So very critical at this point to get invested and involved. I'm going to remind everybody, nobody knows what's going to happen down the road. This is not a moment for cynicism or pessimism. This is a moment to turn your energy in the direction of taking action, particularly, by the way, if you were inspired by No Kings. This is a moment to get deeply involved in local politics where you live, in issues that matter where you live, and to commit to that work for the long haul. All right. Prop 50 in California, yes, please. Because, by the way, this morning, North Carolina submitted another redistricted map that would give them one more seat in the House of Representatives. So if you live in California, please vote yes on Prop 50. I think you all know that already, but it's really, 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 really important. Okay. Reminder again that we are running a brand new program starting on the 1st of November called Power Lab for emerging organizers to overcome outrage and build community power. Again, the link for that is below in the show notes, and I'll make sure it's in a comment as well. Please also make sure that you are subscribed to our sister channel, the Ripple Effect Institute, which is where we do a lot of our amazing change-making work these days. And lastly, of course, if you like what you see here, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel. Please share it with your friends. Let's continue doing all that good work. All right, I'm here live every day for the remainder of the week, and I will see you all here very soon. Take care, everyone. Bye. That's our show for today, folks. Thanks so much for being here at Resistance Live. To get more out of the show, including bonus broadcasts, the answers to all your most pressing political and legal questions, and way more, head on over to patreon.com/resistancelive and become a paid subscriber. And don't forget to hit subscribe here on your favorite podcasting platform to make sure that you never miss an episode. See you next time.